Welcome to Book Talk. Gnashing his teeth, scowling with his eyes and seizing sticks from trees, he began to gnaw at them, and after gnawing them, to break them with increased extraordinary gestures to show the grief and rage he felt. That was the spirit in which, 800 years ago, John, King of England, sealed the Magna Carta. Today that document's regarded as the foundation of our liberties, and its influence through the centuries of political struggle is charted by my guests today, two eminent legal practitioners who've had cause to invoke it themselves. Igor Judge, Lord Judge, the former Lord Chief Justice of England, and Anthony Arlidge QC. And Lord Judge, I suppose you may have seen that set of emotions playing out in your courtroom from time to time, power having its wings publicly clipped.
Not as graphically as that. And this was a story told by a monk who didn't like King John very much. But you do see people very angry and very upset in court. This, after all, was John forced into an agreement that he didn't want to have anything to do with.
And it's about clipping the wings of absolute power, isn't it?
Yes, it is. Exactly that.
The Magna Carta, though, didn't stick for very long in its original incarnation.
No, well, he swore that he'd abide by it. His immortal soul was immediately going down to hell because he had no intention of abiding by it. And he wrote off to the Pope and said, "Can you get rid of it?" The Pope was his feudal lord, and it was annulled within 10 weeks.
But what it did show, the original charter had some clauses that were removed from the later versions, because there were actually 4 Magna Cartas between 1215 and 1225, all with different texts. But in the original one, there were some very striking clauses providing that, for instance, the tax of scutage could only be imposed with the consent of the Council of the Realm, and then quite detailed provisions as to how that council should be summoned. Now that was a very early, possibly the earliest example of citizens reining in the power of the king, and it was maybe well be that he had in mind when he was gnawing away at his sticks. So it was a very powerful image which wasn't forgotten, because although that clause was omitted from later versions, much later on, about in the 1230s, some of the knights and burgesses summoned to Parliament and the nobles said, we're not going to give you taxes because we haven't been summoned in the form required in the charter. So it did live on, that original one.
Well, and indeed, when Henry III came to power, he asked for some taxes to go and fight a war in France, and those assembled said, "You reissue the charter, please, then you can have your money." And it became, this is the foundation of no taxation without representation. It became the foundation of our parliamentary system, in which finance and tax is for Parliament.
Of course, there was an awful lot in the original Magna Carta that didn't last forever. Stuff about fishing weirs in the Thames and the Medway, for example. But so what are the key bits? You've mentioned one of them, but what are the key bits that have resounded through the centuries?
Well, from my view, the 3 are: the justice won't be delayed or denied, and the court of the king will be maintained in a fixed place so that people would know where to go. The moment you say justice won't be delayed or denied, you're then saying there has to be a system in which justice is done. That, I think, rings right down to today. When we talk about people detained in Guantanamo Bay, we're talking about detained without trial. There has to be a trial process so that justice can be done. That's the one that's gone all the way through. The scutage aid one is a very important one, but it was to do with taxation. For example, well, perhaps the for example may not matter. The council had to be consulted. That led, when Charles I was claiming to rule by divine right, to it being said, well, hang on, you have no divine right. You can't just have forced loans. You can't lock people up because they won't pay the money you want. And that was the foundation for our parliamentary system. And the most important clause, although it was very quickly forgotten, is Clause 61, the last one, in which the king accepts that if he doesn't abide by the charter, the barons can enforce it, give him notice, and if he doesn't comply with the notice, they can then enabled not to be faithful to him. This is amazing. Suddenly the king is beneath the law, and he accepts it. No wonder he was gnashing his teeth.
You can see why he was chewing on all those
Absolutely.
sticks. But all this came about because the king at that time, 800 years ago, King John, was greatly weakened. He had failed militarily in various adventures in France. He had been extorting the barons, as you delicately put it, making free with their wives and daughters on occasion. He had made himself thoroughly unpopular. And
He
they
also
were
killed quite a lot of people.
Well,
murdered
indeed.
them.
Including his nephew.
Yeah.
So that was why and how we got Magna Carta in the end, simply because the overwhelming power of the monarch was no longer there.
Well, there's a line that runs through this, that there was an Anglo-Saxon tradition that the king ruled with the advice of his nobles. And the Norman and Angevin kings, when they came to power, promised to maintain that. In practice, they didn't. They did whatever they wanted to do. And the anger in 1215 wasn't just over a few years. It was something that had built up through the previous century. And you're quite right that this was the opportune moment for the barons to strike. John had become known as soft sword or Lackland, and that was the image that he had. And it was the barons seized their opportunity.
But just as the king was at a disadvantage then, the balance tilted back and forth, and Magna Carta tilted back and forth with it. Sometimes it was reaffirmed, sometimes it was almost deaffirmed or at least set aside.
Yes, we're talking about the history of hundreds of years. And there's no doubt that some kings were less inclined to worry about it, but until the 15th century, every new king reissued it. So, for example, when Henry IV became king, Richard II was put in effect on trial, and the charge against him is that he hasn't done justice according to Magna Carta. He said he can produce the law, nobody else can, and there it is in the indictment against him in the attainder in Parliament. I mean, so it lived on, and although we had no television and no radio, and let alone really modern means of communication, people knew about it. We know of a case in 1226 where 4 knights took on the High Sheriff on the basis they hadn't obeyed the Charter of the Land. So people talked about it. It became embedded in the conscience of the nation, in my view.
And talking of high sheriffs, there's a walk-on part in this book for the famous Sheriff of Nottingham, and indeed for, at least implicitly, Robin Hood. One of the things in the Magna Carta, or one of the things outside the Magna Carta, in effect, was the running of the royal forests.
Yes.
There's this wonderful phrase about the king's powers to maintain vert and venison, or is it venison and vert? But the forests were royal preserves, and the king's writ ran there, and there wasn't really a proper law inside them, and that blows up in his face at one point.
It was John, in order to bypass his barons, started importing mercenaries from Touraine, south of Normandy, and putting them in positions of power. The Nottingham was a power base for John, and there's a list of men in the Charter which says these chaps have got to go and they can never rule again. And one of them is the Sheriff of Nottinghamshire. There wasn't a Sheriff of Nottingham at that time. So it does fit exactly in with the legend of Robin Hood.
There's a touch of Errol Flynn about the whole tale, perhaps.
Yeah.
Or Russell Crowe.
But over the centuries, as you say, the Magna Carta played out again and again. There's a very bad moment where King James I, coming south to take up the throne of England after the death of Queen Elizabeth, stops off and arbitrarily has someone executed using the royal power, and there's almost a quiver of shock at this happening.
Yes. Yes, the Stuarts came from Scotland. They didn't have Magna Carta. They had no parliament of the kind that our Tudor kings had created in order to get the Reformation through. And to start with, of course, it was honeymooning. Everybody was thrilled. Elizabeth was dead. We now celebrate her life, but shortly after she was dead, nobody thought much of her. She was a tired old lady. People were bored. So we had this new king, and he gave lots and lots of knighthoods and baronetcies out for money, and everybody's frightfully chuffed with him. But the warning signs were there. Hang on, this is very strange. You hang a man before he's tried. Well, maybe you try him before he's committed a crime. A very serious point was being made.
And all this boils up over a generation or so into the Civil War itself, in which Magna Carta again is one of the underlying principles that's at stake.
Oh, well, before we get to the Civil War, sorry, Tony.
Well, I was going to say Lord Chief Justice Cook, who was almost as good a Chief Justice as Igor, he said that Magna Carta has no sovereign. In fact, he tended to rather twist the meaning of some of the clauses, but most of his argument for the proposition that the king was subject to the law like everybody else, he drew those arguments from Magna Carta.
And we're back almost to the medieval pattern of kings not wanting to be encumbered with all this law and trying to break the bonds of it, and that was what the Civil War ultimately was about.
Well, and bear in mind what's going on in Europe. Simultaneously, the Estates General in France is declining rapidly. It ceases to function at all.
The French sort of proto-parliament.
And the same in Spain, the Cortes. These organisations had existed in early times, just like our original parliaments had, but they declined under the absolutist monarchs that they had in France and Spain, whereas here Parliament won.
So Parliament didn't go out of fashion here, even if it did elsewhere?
No.
And the consequence of some of the, I mean, you've raised the international dimension here. The consequence of all this is that Magna Carta starts getting quoted in some quite unlikely places a bit later on. It features in the American Revolution, it features in the French Revolution.
Well, in so far as, don't forget, though they don't like to be reminded of it, the colonists in the eastern seaboard of the United States were English citizens with the rights of Englishmen. The first charter given to the colonies was called the Great Charter. I mean, one doesn't have to be very clever to think what they were thinking about. And it was the charter that they relied on, or what they understood the charter to provide them, in their opposition to the Stamp Act and the Declaratory Act, all of which said you have all your rights as Englishmen. The only right you don't have is the right to vote. So none of the colonists had the right to vote. Not many people in England had the right to vote. But this actually stuck in their craw because they were in effect being taxed, and nobody was asking them what they would like to do about it.
So the embedded principle of Magna Carta was flowering once again.
Yes, it was.
It was a recurring theme because Henry II had established an empire that ran from Normandy right down to the Spanish border. John lost it all by 1204, and thereafter all his descendants fought wars in France and had to raise taxes. And every time they came to ask for taxes to fight a war, the Parliament said, OK, you can have your tax, but confer Magna Carta. So that it was an ongoing theme right the way through to the 17th century and beyond, and then played back against England by the United States.
And indeed invoked in the French Revolution as well, where Magna Carta, in effect, was one of the demands of the revolutionaries.
Yes, but they didn't think so. What I mean by that is that although Thomas Jefferson from the States told Lafayette, really what you need to have is a sort of Magna Carta arrangement, Lafayette didn't carry the day, and then they got the guillotine, I'm afraid.
Which is an awful
there's
cautionary
still a
tale.
clause in the French Constitution that derives from clause 39 of Magna Carta that no free man will be imprisoned or hurt or dispossessed without a proper trial, without, in effect, due process.
And that, to bring it slightly more up to date, was enshrined also in the UN Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. Magna Carta seems to kind of pop up in all sorts of places. Is it something that international lawyers get together and talk about in conferences and spread these ideas? Or it seems to be almost universal.
That's
now.
a good question, because I'm going to chair such a conference this week. But no, I think that for us, it's symbolic, totemic. It's our banner. When we think that our rights are being undermined, we think Magna Carta. In a recent Parliament, there was a proposal to change trial by jury. Everybody got up in the House of Commons and said, this goes back to Magna Carta. Well, it doesn't. Trial by jury doesn't figure in Magna Carta. But it's emblematic. When people are going back to what they regard as our ancient liberties and rights, they think it's in Magna Carta. And that's its value. It's a very nice, neat little shorthand. You can say our liberties are threatened. Magna Carta.
The gentleman who invented the World Wide Web was on television not long ago saying that he was very worried about the way that the web was being used now by governments and various other people. And he said, what we really need is a Magna Carta for the web. And he was using that as his shorthand to say there must be some measure of control.
Ancient liberties in a modern setting. Well, thank you both very much indeed for joining us here on Book Talk. And Book Talk will be back again next week. Do join us then. Thank you.